Welcome to tonight's story. As you settle into your bed, feel the soft embrace of your blankets and let go of the day's worries. Close your eyes and take a deep breath, allowing the calm of the evening to surround you. Imagine the world growing quieter, the stars shining softly above as you drift into a peaceful state of relaxation. Tonight, we journey to the magical kingdom of Eldoria, where ancient prophecies, enchanted swords, and a humble hero await. Let the gentle rhythm of the tale lull you into a restful sleep as we begin the story of the Enchanted Sword. In a time long past, when the stars still whispered their secrets to the earth, there existed a kingdom where peace had reigned for many generations. This kingdom, known as Eldoria, was nestled between rolling emerald hills and shimmering rivers, where the sun always seemed to shine just a little brighter. The people of Eldoria lived in harmony, their lives untouched by war or famine, for they were protected by the blessing of an ancient magic, an enchantment woven into the very air they breathed. Yet, beneath this veil of peace, a shadow was stirring. Whispers of an ancient prophecy echoed through the land, carried on the winds and murmured by the old and wise. The prophecy spoke of a time when darkness would once again rise, a malevolent force that would threaten to consume the light of the world. This darkness, known only as the Shadow King, had been defeated centuries ago by a great and noble hero who wielded a sword of divine light. The sword, Luminara, was said to have been forged in the heart of a fallen star and gifted by the gods themselves. It had the power to banish all evil, but only if wielded by one whose heart was as pure as the sword's light. Now, with the passage of time, the Shadow King had awoken from his prison in the deepest abyss. His presence, though still unseen, was felt in the growing unease that crept into the hearts of the people. The skies began to darken earlier each day, and a chill, unnatural for the season, hung in the air. Crops withered where they should have flourished, and animals took to hiding, sensing the evil that was slowly spreading its claws across the land. In the quiet village of Hearthstone, far from the bustling capital, lived a young man named Elian. He was a simple villager, tending to his family's modest farm, with little thought of grand adventures or the distant whispers of war. Yet Elian was known for his kindness, his unwavering honesty, and his courage, though few ever needed to call upon it. He helped his neighbors without hesitation and cared for the land with the respect passed down through his ancestors. To him, there was no greater honor than living a life of quiet service to his village and family. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. One autumn evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the village prepared to rest, the village elder, a man of great age and wisdom, called for a gathering. The elder's voice, though frail with age, carried an undeniable weight, and when he spoke, the villagers listened. They gathered around the great oak tree at the center of Hearthstone, where the elder, his face lined with the years of knowledge and care, began to tell them of the growing danger. "The ancient evil has awakened," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "The Shadow King stirs once more, and soon his darkness will fall upon our lands. Only the Sword of Light, Luminara, can save us, but it remains hidden, awaiting the one who is worthy to wield it." The crowd murmured in fear, for the prophecy was known to all, yet it had been a distant tale, a legend of old. Now the threat felt all too real. The elder's eyes scanned the faces of his people, and then they settled on Elian. "There is one among us," he continued, "whose heart may be pure enough to seek the sword. Elian, "Son of Roderick, I see in you the light that may guide us through this darkness." Elian's heart raced in his chest. He, a mere farmer's son, chosen to seek the sword of legend. He wanted to refuse, to shrink back into the safety of his simple life. But something deep within him stirred, a spark of courage he had never known existed. The words of the elder echoed in his mind, and with a deep breath, Elian stepped forward. "If I am to be the one," Elian said, his voice steady though his hands trembled, "then I will do all I can to find Luminara and protect our land." The villagers watched in silence as the elder approached Elian and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You carry more than your own fate on this journey, young one," the elder whispered. "The light of the kingdom rests in your hands." And so, with the weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders, Elian's journey began. The first step on a path that would change his life and the fate of Eldoria forever. Elian had never ventured far from Hearthstone, his days spent tending the fields or mending fences. The world beyond his village was a mystery, one he had never thought to explore. But now, as he set out on the road toward the unknown, the weight of the elder's words pressed heavily upon him. Each step felt like a question. Was he truly worthy? Could he find the sword? Would he, a simple villager, be able to face the Shadow King? The early morning mist clung to the earth as Elian walked along the cobbled path that wound through the woods. Birds, stirred by his passing, fluttered from the trees, and the soft crunch of leaves beneath his boots was the only sound. Though his heart was full of doubt, there was a fire in him, kindled by the elder's faith. Elian knew that if he faltered now, the darkness would swallow everything he loved. Days passed in quiet solitude as Elian journeyed onward, his destination uncertain. The villagers had spoken of Luminara for generations, but none knew where it rested. Some claimed it was hidden in the crystalline cavern, deep within the mountains, while others believed it had been taken to the farthest reaches of the kingdom, guarded by forces unseen. All Elian had was a vague sense of direction, and the knowledge that his heart must remain pure. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky bled into twilight, Elian found himself near a small village named Briarwood. Weary from the road, he decided to rest there for the night. The village was quiet, its streets lit only by the soft glow of lanterns, and the people seemed wary, glancing up at the sky as though expecting something terrible to fall from it. Elian made his way to the inn, where he was greeted by the innkeeper, a stout man with a kind face lined with worry. "A traveller, eh?" the innkeeper said, motioning for Elian to sit by the fire. "Not many passing through these days. Dark times are upon us." Elian nodded, feeling the weight of his secret. "The darkness is spreading," he said softly, "and I'm afraid it will only grow worse." The innkeeper looked at him for a moment, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. "You speak as though you've seen it," he said. "But you're young, not a soldier. What brings you so far from home?" Elian hesitated, but something in the innkeeper's gaze told him he could be trusted. "I'm seeking Luminara, the Sword of Light," Elian said, his voice low. "The prophecy says it's the only thing that can stop the Shadow King." The innkeeper's eyes widened, and he glanced around the room as though the very walls might be listening. "Luminara," he whispered, his tone reverent. "I've heard of it. But lad, that's no small task. Many have sought it, and none have returned." "I have no choice," Elian replied, the word surprising even himself. "The elder of my village believes I may be worthy to wield it." The innkeeper studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I see something in you," he said quietly. "Something rare. But listen, if you're to find Luminara, you must first pass through the Veil of Whispers. It's not far from here, but it's dangerous. The veil is said to test the hearts of all who enter it, and only those with true purity of heart can make it through unscathed." Ellion felt a chill crawl down his spine at the mention of the veil. He had heard of it in passing, a place where the very air seemed to hum with magic, where travelers spoke of voices that whispered their darkest secrets and fears. But it was also said that the veil was the first step on the path to the sword. "Thank you," Ellion said, rising from his seat by the fire. "I'll rest here tonight and head for the veil at first light." The innkeeper nodded solemnly. "May the gods watch over you, young hero," he said. "For if you make it through the veil, you may well be the one we've been waiting for." That night, as Ellion lay in the quiet room provided by the innkeeper, he stared up at the ceiling, the flickering light of the lantern casting shadows across the walls. His thoughts raced, his heart heavy with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The Veil of Whispers would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. But deep inside, a spark of hope remained. For Ellion knew that if his heart was pure, the sword would guide him, and with it, he could stand against the rising darkness. Tomorrow, his true test would begin. The sun was just beginning to rise when Ellion left Briarwood behind, the innkeeper's words still echoing in his mind. Ahead of him lay the Veil of Whispers, a place shrouded in mystery and fear, where the pure of heart could pass, but where others lost themselves to their darkest desires. Ellion had heard of the veil in stories, but now that it loomed before him, it seemed more like a nightmare than a fable. The path to the veil grew narrower and darker as Ellion approached. The trees thickened, their branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out the sun. A mist clung to the ground, curling around his boots as if trying to pull him into the earth. The air grew colder, and soon, the only sound was the soft rustling of leaves, like whispers carried on the wind. At the entrance to the veil stood 2 stone pillars, ancient and weathered, covered in moss. Between them lay the threshold of the veil, a thin line where the mist seemed thicker, darker. Ellion took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever lay ahead. His heart pounded in his chest, but he remembered the elder's words. "The light of the kingdom rests in your hands." With that thought, he stepped forward, crossing into the Veil of Whispers. The moment he entered, the air around him seemed to shift. The mist rose higher, swirling like a living thing, and faint voices began to murmur in the distance. At first, they were soft, barely audible. But as Ellion walked deeper into the veil, they grew louder, until they seemed to surround him from all sides. "Ellion," the voices whispered, calling his name. "You are not strong enough. You're just a simple farmer. You will fail. Turn back before it's too late." Ellion clenched his fists, trying to push the voices from his mind. But they persisted, their words digging into his thoughts like thorns. His steps faltered, and for a moment, doubt washed over him. What if they were right? What if he wasn't strong enough? What if he couldn't find Luminara? What if he wasn't the hero everyone hoped he would be? The mist thickened, and suddenly, before him, the shadowy outline of a figure appeared. It was himself, but distorted, twisted. This dark reflection of Ellion sneered at him, its eyes full of malice. "Look at you," the reflection hissed. "A mere boy, pretending to be a hero. You think a sword will make you worthy? You are nothing without it. You'll only bring ruin to those you seek to protect. Elien felt the weight of the words pressed down on him, heavy as stone. The reflection's words stung, because deep down they echoed his own fears. His hands trembled, and for a moment he thought of turning back, of returning to Hearthstone, where his life was simple, where he wasn't responsible for saving an entire kingdom. But then, a memory flickered in his mind. The elder's hand on his shoulder, the villagers' hopeful faces, and the innkeeper's quiet belief in him. They had seen something in him that he had yet to see in himself. His journey wasn't just about finding the sword. It was about proving that he could rise to the challenge. "No," Elien said, his voice firm, cutting through the whispers. "I may not be the strongest, but my heart is true. I don't seek the sword for power. I seek it to protect my home." The reflection's sneer faltered, and the mist began to thin. The voices grew fainter, and the dark figure slowly dissolved into nothingness. Elien stood tall, his heart beating with renewed strength. He had passed the first test of the veil, the test of self-doubt. But the veil was not finished with him. As he walked further, the whispers returned, no longer filled with doubt, but with temptation. Visions danced in the mist, mountains of gold, kingdoms at his feet, people bowing to him as a king. "You could have it all," the voices cooed. "Power beyond your wildest dreams. All you must do is take it." Elien's steps slowed as the allure of the visions tugged at him. The idea of power was intoxicating, the promise of riches tempting. But then, he remembered his village, his family, his friends, the simple life he had lived. What good were riches or power if he lost himself in the pursuit? What good was a kingdom if it was built on greed? "No," he said once more, his voice steady. "I don't seek power or wealth. I seek only to protect those I love." And with that, the visions vanished, the mist parted, and Elien found himself at the edge of the veil. The air was clear again, and the sun broke through the trees, casting golden light upon the path ahead. Elien had passed the trials of the veil, his heart still pure. But he knew that the hardest part of his journey was yet to come. The sword was still far from his grasp, and the Shadow King's darkness grew with every passing day. The veil of whispers now behind him, Elien pressed onward toward the next leg of his journey, the crystalline cavern where the legendary sword Luminara was said to rest. With the trials of the heart freshly endured, Elien felt a sense of quiet strength blooming within him. He had not given in to doubt or temptation, and though his path was still uncertain, he knew now that he had something more valuable than gold or power, a heart that could withstand the dark. The crystalline cavern was said to be a place of great beauty, but also of peril. Few had ventured there, and fewer still had returned. Legends spoke of ancient guardians who watched over the sword, testing all who sought to claim it. These guardians, forged from the very magic that created Luminara, would not be defeated by strength alone. They tested the spirit, the mind, and the very soul. As Elien journeyed through the forest and over the hills, the landscape began to change. The air grew colder, and the trees thinned, their branches stark against the sky. The ground beneath his feet became rocky, the path more treacherous. Soon, Elien could see the entrance to the crystalline cavern, a dark mouth in the side of a towering cliff. From within, a faint light shimmered, as though the cavern itself was alive with magic. Elien took a deep breath and stepped inside. The cavern was vast, its walls glistening with crystals that reflected the dim light of the sun outside. Stalactites hung like fangs from the ceiling, and the floor sparkled with veins of silver and gold. The air was cold and still, and every step Elien took echoed softly, as if the cavern was listening to his every move. Deeper he went, following the faint glow of the crystals, until he reached the heart of the cavern. There, in the center of a wide chamber, stood a pedestal made of smooth, polished stone. Upon it rested Luminara, its blade gleaming with an ethereal light. The sword was beautiful, its hilt wrapped in gold and silver, and the blade itself seemed to hum with a quiet, powerful magic. But Elien was not alone. As he stepped toward the sword, the ground trembled beneath him. From the shadows at the edges of the chamber, 3 figures emerged, beings unlike anything Elien had ever seen. They were tall, their forms made of shimmering crystal and stone, their eyes glowing with an ancient light. These were the guardians of Luminara, the protectors of the Enchanted Sword, and they moved with the grace and precision of beings who had existed for centuries. One of the guardians stepped forward, its voice like the rumble of distant thunder. "Who dares seek the Sword of Light?" it asked, its gaze fixed on Elien. "I am Elien, a humble villager," Elien replied, his voice steady despite the awe and fear that coursed through him. "I seek Luminara to defeat the Shadow King and protect my kingdom from darkness." The guardians exchanged a glance, their crystalline forms catching the light and casting rainbows across the cavern walls. "The sword is not meant for those who seek power or glory," another guardian said, its voice softer but no less commanding. "It can only be wielded by one whose heart is pure, whose spirit is unyielding." "I seek no glory," Elien said earnestly. "I seek only to protect those I love." The third guardian, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "To claim Luminara is to face the trials of virtue. Only by passing these tests can you prove your worth. Are you prepared?" Elien swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their words. He had come this far, but now he faced the final challenge. There could be no turning back. "I am prepared," he said. The first guardian raised its hand, and the air around them shimmered as the trials began. The first test was one of wisdom. Before Elien, a vision appeared, a village in flames, people crying for help. But beside the village lay a path leading to the Shadow King's lair. Elien had to choose, rescue the village or confront the Shadow King before his power grew. The answer lay not in logic, but in his heart. He knew he could not leave the village to suffer, even if it meant delaying his quest. "I will save the village," he said. The vision faded, and the second guardian nodded, satisfied. The next test was one of compassion. A wounded stranger appeared before Elien, begging for help. Though Elien's journey was urgent and time was running short, he knelt to help the stranger, bandaging his wounds and offering him food and water. The second guardian's eyes gleamed with approval. Finally, the third test was one of humility. Elien was shown a vision of himself as a great king, with armies at his command and treasures beyond imagination. But as he gazed upon the vision, he realized that none of it mattered. Power, wealth, and titles were meaningless without kindness and love. "I need no crown," Elien said quietly. "I am content to be who I am." With that, the trials ended, and the guardians stepped aside, their crystalline forms glowing with approval. "You have proven yourself, Elien," the first guardian said. "You may claim Luminara." Elien approached the pedestal, his heart filled with a quiet awe. As he wrapped his hand around the hilt, the sword seemed to come alive, its light flaring to life in his grasp. In that moment, Elien knew that the sword had chosen him, not because of his strength, but because of his heart. With Luminara in hand, Elien felt the weight of his destiny. The Shadow King awaited, and the true battle was only just beginning. With the Sword of Light, Luminara now in his hands, Elien felt an immense warmth flood through him. The sword's glow wasn't harsh or blinding, but soft and gentle, like the first light of dawn after a long, dark night. It hummed faintly in his grip, a sound that seemed to speak directly to his heart, whispering of hope, of courage, and of a power far beyond the physical realm. For a moment, Elien simply stood there, marveling at the beauty of the enchanted blade. The handle fit perfectly in his grasp, as if it had been made for him alone. The blade itself shimmered with an otherworldly light, reflecting the crystal walls of the cavern, casting ethereal rainbows that danced across the stone. It was lighter than he had expected, yet there was a weight to it, not of metal, but of responsibility. The guardians watched in silence, their glowing eyes never leaving Elien. Though they had no mouths, he sensed their approval in the air, a quiet acknowledgement that he had passed their trials, that he was the one worthy of Luminara's power. But as the warmth of the sword seeped into him, Elien also felt the gravity of what lay ahead. The Shadow King had grown stronger in the days since Elien had left Hearthstone, and the darkness spreading across the land was relentless. Elien could feel it now, like a distant storm cloud on the horizon, inching closer with every heartbeat. The people of Eldoria were depending on him, not just to wield the sword, but to banish the evil that threatened to consume them all. Steeling himself, Elien turned to the guardians. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice reverent in the cavern's echoing silence. "I will not fail." The first guardian, its crystalline form shimmering in the light of the sword, stepped forward. "The sword has chosen you, Elien of Hearthstone," it said, its voice like the echo of a bell ringing in a distant valley. "But remember, Luminara is not a weapon of destruction. It is a beacon of light. It is not the blade that will defeat the Shadow King, but the purity of your heart." Elien nodded, the guardian's words resonating deep within him. He had always known that this quest was not one of strength alone. It was his heart, his compassion, and his unwavering dedication to his people that would guide him through the darkness. The second guardian, taller and more imposing, spoke next. "You must also remember this. The Shadow King's power lies in fear and doubt. He will seek to corrupt your spirit, to turn you against yourself. But as long as you hold true to your purpose, his darkness cannot touch you." The third guardian, whose form was delicate and ethereal, reached out a hand. "Go now, young hero," it said softly. "The fate of the kingdom rests in your hands. But know that you do not carry this burden alone. The light within Luminara will guide you as long as your heart remains pure." With their blessing, Elien bowed to the guardians, then turned and made his way out of the crystalline cavern. As he stepped back into the light of the outside world, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the land. The sight was bittersweet, for while the world was bathed in light now, Elien knew that darkness was creeping closer with every passing moment. He set off at once, the path before him clearer than it had ever been. His destination was the Darklands, a desolate and barren region far to the north, where the Shadow King's fortress lay hidden. The road would be perilous, and the journey long, but Elien felt a new strength within him. The trials he had faced in the Vale of Whispers, and now in the crystalline cavern, had forged him into something more than a simple villager. He was the one destined to bear Luminara, the Sword of Light, and he would not falter. As he walked, the sword's light illuminated the path ahead, casting away the growing shadows of dusk. The glow was warm and reassuring, a constant reminder of the hope he carried not only for himself, but for all of Eldoria. Days passed, and Ellion moved swiftly, never lingering in one place for too long. The further north he travelled, the colder the air became, and the land itself seemed to grow darker, more desolate. The trees thinned, their leaves withering, and the sky above was often shrouded in thick, grey clouds that blocked out the sun. But Ellion pressed on, undeterred by the bleakness around him. One evening, as he made camp in a small clearing, he felt the first true pangs of doubt creep into his heart. The weight of his task, the enormity of what lay ahead, threatened to overwhelm him. Could he truly face the Shadow King alone? Would Luminara be enough to defeat a being of such ancient and terrible power? But as the doubt swirled within him, he felt the sword hum gently in his hand, its warmth soothing the fear that had begun to rise. Ellion closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He remembered the Guardian's words, the trials he had passed, and the light that had chosen him. He was not alone. As long as he carried the purity of his purpose, the darkness could not claim him. And so, Ellion resolved to continue. The Shadow King's fortress was near, and the final confrontation was at hand. Ellion's journey had taken him far from the quiet fields of Hearthstone, and now he stood on the threshold of the Darklands, the desolate region where the Shadow King's fortress awaited. The once lush and vibrant kingdom of Eldoria had been left behind, replaced by a cold, barren landscape. The sky above was perpetually grey, and a bitter wind howled through the jagged rocks that jutted from the ground like broken teeth. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the sun had long since disappeared behind the shroud of dark clouds that covered the sky. Yet, despite the bleakness around him, Ellion felt the steady hum of Luminara in his hand, its light a small but unwavering beacon in the gathering storm. He knew the final battle was drawing near. The Shadow King's fortress loomed in the distance, a twisted structure of black stone and jagged spires that seemed to defy the very sky itself. Ellion's heart quickened, but he steadied his breath, focusing on the task ahead. As he drew closer to the fortress, Ellion was not alone for long. Along the way, he encountered 3 companions who would join him on this perilous quest. First was Sir Aldrich, an exiled knight who had once served the royal court of Eldoria. Aldrich had been cast out after refusing to pledge loyalty to a corrupt noble, and though his armour was tarnished and his name disgraced, his honour and bravery remained intact. He had heard of Ellion's quest and had sought him out, pledging his sword to the cause of defeating the Shadow King. Next came Mira, a cunning thief from the southern lands. She was as quick with her wits as she was with her hands, and though she had spent most of her life living in the shadows, Mira had a keen sense of justice. She had seen the destruction caused by the Shadow King's forces and had decided to lend her skills to Ellion's quest, knowing that the fight against the growing darkness was one she could not ignore. The last to join them was Leora, a mysterious healer who carried the ancient knowledge of the forest spirits. Leora had lived in solitude for many years, but the whispers of the forest had told her of the darkness spreading across the land. She came to Ellion not just as a healer, but as a guide, for her connection to the ancient magic of Eldoria gave her insight into the forces at play. Together, this unlikely group pressed forward, each with their own reasons for joining the fight, but united in their goal. As they journeyed toward the Shadow King's fortress, the bond between them grew stronger. They shared stories by the fire at night, their laughter a brief reprieve from the ever-present danger that loomed over them. Though their path was fraught with peril, there was comfort in knowing they were not alone. But the road to the fortress was not an easy one. As they crossed the final stretch of land leading into the Darklands, they encountered the Shadow King's minions, creatures born from the darkness itself, twisted and grotesque. These beings were mere shadows, formless and cold, but their attacks were swift and vicious. Ellian fought alongside Aldrich, their swords cutting through the shadowy figures, while Mira darted through the chaos, striking with deadly precision. Leora stood at the back, her hands raised as she summoned the healing powers of the forest, mending wounds as quickly as they were inflicted. Through it all, Luminara shone brightly in Ellian's hand, its light driving back the darkness with each swing. The creatures recoiled from its glow, unable to withstand the purity of the Enchanted Sword. But Ellian knew that these were only the Shadow King's pawns, mere distractions compared to the force that awaited them within the fortress walls. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of battling through the endless hordes, the group stood before the gates of the Shadow King's fortress. The towering black walls loomed above them, casting long shadows across the desolate ground. The air was thick with a palpable darkness, a cold, creeping fear that seemed to seep into their very bones. For a moment, Ellian hesitated, the weight of the sword in his hand suddenly heavier. Sir Aldrich, sensing his unease, placed a hand on Ellian's shoulder. "You are not alone in this fight," the knight said quietly. "We stand with you." Mira grinned, her dagger twirling between her fingers. "And besides, we've come too far to turn back now." Leora, her voice soft but unwavering, added, "The light you carry is stronger than the darkness within these walls. Trust in it, and you will prevail." Ellian nodded, drawing strength from his companion's words. The fear that had gripped him loosened, replaced by a renewed determination. He looked up at the fortress, its jagged spires disappearing into the dark sky, and tightened his grip on Luminara. The sword pulsed with warmth, as if reminding him that he carried more than just a weapon. He carried the hopes of his kingdom and the light of all those who believed in him. With a deep breath, Ellian raised Luminara high, the blade's glow cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The gates of the fortress creaked open with an ominous groan, revealing a long shadowed path that led deeper into the heart of the fortress. The final confrontation was near. The Shadow King awaited. The gates of the Shadow King's fortress groaned as they swung open, revealing a long, narrow passage that disappeared into the heart of darkness. Cold air rushed out, carrying with it the stench of decay and despair. The walls of the fortress were made of jagged black stone, twisting and uneven, as though the fortress itself had been carved from the bones of the earth. Ellian stepped forward, Luminara held high, its soft light barely cutting through the thick shadows. Behind him, Sir Aldrich, Mira and Leora followed in silence, each of them preparing for the battle ahead. The air was thick with tension, and though none of them spoke, their thoughts were clear. This was it, the moment they had been journeying toward. The final confrontation with the Shadow King was upon them. The passage wound deeper into the fortress, its twists and turns like a labyrinth of nightmares. The further they went, the darker the walls became, and the whispers of the Shadow King's magic grew louder, filling the air with a haunting melody of despair. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the darkness was pressing down on them, trying to crush their spirits before they even reached the throne room. At last, the passage opened into a vast cavernous hall. The ceiling was so high that it disappeared into shadow, and the walls were lined with ancient banners, tattered and faded with time. At the far end of the hall sat the Shadow King, his throne a twisted mass of black stone and bones. He was a figure of darkness, cloaked in shadow, his eyes burning with a malevolent fire that seemed to pierce straight through Elian. "You've come at last!" The Shadow King's voice echoed through the hall, deep and cold, like the rumble of distant thunder. "I have been waiting!" Elian stepped forward, his grip tightening on Luminara. The sword pulsed with light, and for a moment the darkness seemed to retreat from it. But the Shadow King merely laughed, a low, hollow sound that sent chills down their spines. "You think that sword will save you?" the Shadow King sneered. "You are nothing but a boy, led by fools and whispers of hope. This world belongs to the darkness now. You cannot stop what is already done." The words struck Elian like a blow, the weight of the Shadow King's power pressing down on him. But he refused to falter. He had come too far to give in to fear now. His heart burned with the light of everything he had fought for. The people of Hearthstone, the companions who stood with him, and the kingdom of Eldoria, whose fate rested in his hands. "I don't seek to stop you with this sword," Elian said, his voice strong despite the darkness that surrounded him. "Luminara is not a weapon of destruction. It is a beacon of hope, a light that will guide us through the darkness." The Shadow King rose from his throne, his figure towering and monstrous. His cloak of shadows seemed to writhe and twist around him, and with a wave of his hand, the hall filled with darkness so thick that it swallowed the light of Luminara. Elian could hear the shouts of his companions, but the shadows obscured them from his sight. He was alone in the abyss, the Shadow King's voice echoing all around him. "You are weak," the Shadow King hissed. "You will fail, just as all who came before you. The darkness will consume everything you love, and you will be left with nothing." The shadows pressed in, cold and suffocating. Elian's mind raced, and for a moment the weight of the Shadow King's power seemed unbearable. Doubt flickered in his heart, threatening to extinguish the light within him. But then, in the stillness of the dark, Elian remembered the trials he had faced. He remembered the whispers of doubt in the veil, the Guardian's lessons of humility and compassion in the crystalline cavern, and the unwavering belief of his companions. His heart was not ruled by fear or power. It was guided by love, by the hope of a better future for his people. And as long as he held on to that, the darkness could not touch him. With renewed strength, Elian gripped Luminara tightly, feeling its warmth return to him. "No," he whispered, his voice steady. "You are wrong. I am not alone." The sword blazed with light, brighter than it ever had before, cutting through the suffocating shadows. The darkness recoiled, and for the first time, the Shadow King hesitated. Elian could see him now, standing at the far end of the hall, his figure shrinking before the radiant glow of Luminara. The light pushed the shadows away, revealing Sir Aldrich, Mira, and Leora, their faces filled with determination as they stood beside him once more. Elian stepped forward, Luminara shining like a star in the darkness. The Shadow King raised his hand, but the power of the sword was too great. Elian swung the blade, and with a brilliant flash, the light of Luminara struck the Shadow King. His cloak of shadows dissolved into nothingness, and his monstrous form crumbled to the ground, reduced to ash in the face of the pure light. The hall was silent. The darkness that had once filled the fortress was gone, and the air was clear once more. Ellion stood there, Luminara still glowing faintly in his hand, the weight of the moment washing over him. The Shadow King was defeated, not by the sword alone, but by the light that Ellion carried in his heart. His companions gathered around him, their faces etched with relief and awe. The battle was over, but the journey was not yet complete. They had saved Eldoria from the Shadow King's darkness, but the light of Luminara would continue to guide them as they rebuilt the kingdom and restored hope to the land. The Shadow King's fortress stood in eerie silence, the oppressive darkness that had once consumed it now lifted by the light of Luminara. Ellion, breathless and still clutching the sword, stared at the ash that had once been the Shadow King. The final battle had ended, yet the weight of what had transpired pressed upon him like the quiet before a storm. The fortress no longer seemed menacing, its towering black walls now casting long shadows instead of swallowing the light. But there was something in the air, a lingering sense that not all was as it seemed. As his companions gathered around him, Sir Aldrich, Mira and Leora, the air felt lighter, filled with the soft, glowing remnants of Luminara's light. For a moment, there was only quiet, a stillness that felt like the world was catching its breath. "It's over," Mira whispered, her voice almost disbelieving. Her sharp eyes softened as she looked at Ellion, admiration and relief mixing in her gaze. "You did it." Ellion shook his head slightly. "We did it," he corrected, his voice low and humble. "Without you, I could not have made it this far." Sir Aldrich stepped forward, his armor clinking softly in the echoing hall. "There's more to be done," he said gravely, though his eyes glistened with the satisfaction of victory. "The kingdom has been freed from the Shadow King's grip, but we must ensure his darkness does not return." Leora, standing with the quiet grace of one who knows the deeper truths of the world, approached the remains of the Shadow King, her hand hovering over the ashes. "The Shadow King was not born of this world," she said softly, her voice as gentle as a breeze. "He was a ruler once, like any other, but his heart was corrupted by fear, by greed, by a lust for power. The darkness that consumed him lives within all of us, waiting for the moment it can strike." Ellion frowned, her words settling deep into his heart. "Then, was the Shadow King once like me?" he asked, glancing at the sword still glowing in his hand. Leora nodded slowly. "Perhaps, though his choices led him down a different path. That is the true power of darkness. It feeds on the weakness within us. But you, Ellion, chose differently. You carried the light not just in your sword, but in your heart." Ellion stood quietly for a moment, absorbing her words. The journey had not just been about the sword. It had been about the battle within himself. A battle between light and darkness, between fear and hope. He had not sought power or glory. His heart had remained pure, dedicated only to protecting those he loved. That was what had allowed him to wield Luminara. As they stood in the hall, a faint glow began to fill the air, soft at first, but growing brighter. Ellion looked down at Luminara, the blade now shining with a radiance that was almost blinding. He felt the warmth of its light seep into him once more, not with the intensity of battle, but with a gentle, reassuring presence. The sword had done its duty, and now its light was fading, returning to the realm from which it had come. Suddenly, the ashes of the Shadow King began to stir. But instead of a dark force rising from them, a figure emerged, no longer twisted and monstrous, but a man, young and regal, dressed in simple, noble robes. His face was peaceful, his once burning eyes now calm. "I was lost," the man said, his voice filled with regret, "consumed by the darkness within me. But you showed me the light that I had forgotten." Elien stood frozen, unsure what to say. This was the Shadow King, no longer a monster, but a man who had once been like him. Before Elien could speak, the man smiled sadly, his form beginning to fade like the last traces of a dream. "Thank you," the man whispered. "May you never lose your light." And with that, he vanished, leaving nothing behind but the faint echo of his words. Elien lowered Luminara, his heart heavy yet strangely light. The Shadow King had been defeated, not by destruction, but by compassion. His heart had been freed from the darkness that had consumed him, and now he was at peace. As the last of the light from the sword faded, the cavern around them seemed to breathe with new life. The walls no longer loomed with menace, but shimmered with a soft glow, as if the fortress itself had been waiting for this moment of release. The dark reign of the Shadow King had ended, and the land would heal. Elien turned to his companions, the weight of the sword lifted from his shoulders. He smiled, though his heart ached with the knowledge of the journey that had brought him here. "It's time to go home," he said softly. They nodded in agreement, and together they turned and walked back through the halls of the fortress, leaving behind the shadows and stepping into the light of a new dawn. The journey had been long and fraught with danger, but Elien had learned the greatest lesson of all, that true strength came not from the sword he wielded, but from the light he carried within himself. And so, as they left the dark fortress behind, the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting their golden light across the land. Eldoria was free, its future bright, and Elien's name would be remembered for generations as the hero who had saved the kingdom, not with a sword, but with the pure heart of a true champion. The journey back to Hearthstone was a quiet one. Elien, Sir Aldrich, Mira and Leora travelled through the once dark lands that had at last begun to heal. The skies, once veiled in gloom, now glowed with the soft colours of dawn, and the land, barren and cold before, showed signs of new life. Tiny green shoots sprouted from the earth, and the birds, once silenced by the Shadow King's reign, sang joyfully again. Elien walked at the front of the group, Luminara now resting in its scabbard at his side, its light diminished but still a comforting presence. The warmth of the sword had dimmed after the battle, as if it too knew that its purpose had been fulfilled. Elien, however, carried more than just the sword. He carried the knowledge that he had been tested, not just by the Shadow King, but by himself, and that he had emerged victorious, not as a warrior, but as a guardian of light. When they reached Hearthstone, the village was as peaceful as Elien had left it, though the people were quick to gather when they saw him return. Word had already spread of the Shadow King's defeat, and as the villagers crowded around him, their eyes filled with wonder and hope. They whispered Elien's name, some in awe, some in disbelief that their quiet village had produced the hero who had saved the kingdom. The village elder, his face lined with both age and wisdom, approached Elien with a smile that spoke of pride and relief. "You have done what none thought possible," the elder said, his voice thick with emotion. "The Shadow King has been defeated, and the kingdom is safe because of you." Elien bowed his head humbly. "I did not do it alone," he replied softly. Without Sir Aldrich, Mira and Leora, I could not have faced what lay ahead. And it was not just the sword that saved us. It was the light that we all carried. The light of hope. The villagers, hearing his words, looked to his companions, and a murmur of gratitude spread through the crowd. Sir Aldrich, standing tall and proud, nodded in acknowledgement, while Mira grinned, her mischievous eyes sparkling. Leora, serene and graceful as ever, stood quietly, her connection to the ancient magic still palpable in the air around her. The elder placed a hand on Elian's shoulder. "You have brought peace to our land," he said, "and for that you will always be remembered." But Elian, though grateful, felt a tug of uncertainty in his heart. "What should become of Luminara?" he asked, glancing down at the sword. Its light had been so crucial in the battle, yet now it seemed to belong more to legend than to him. "The sword is too powerful to remain with me. Its magic must be protected." The elder smiled, his eyes crinkling with wisdom. "Luminara has chosen you, Elian, but its light is not meant to be wielded forever. The sword belongs not to one person, but to the kingdom. Its place is in the Hall of Heroes, where it will rest until the world needs it once more." Elian nodded, knowing the elder spoke the truth. The sword had served its purpose, and now it would return to legend, awaiting the day when it might be needed again. The thought brought him peace, for he had learned that true strength did not come from a weapon, but from the heart that wielded it. And so, with a heavy heart but a sense of completion, Elian journeyed to the capital with his companions, where Luminara was placed in the Hall of Heroes, among the relics of the past. The sword, now at rest, would be a beacon of hope for generations to come, a reminder that light always triumphs over darkness. In the years that followed, Elian's name became legend, his story told in villages and cities alike. But he did not seek fame or fortune. He returned to Hearthstone, content to live a simple life once more, tending to the land and caring for those he loved. The villagers would often come to him for wisdom, and children would beg to hear the story of the hero who had wielded the Sword of Light. Elian, always humble, would tell them that the true hero was not the one who held the sword, but the one who kept their heart pure, even in the face of darkness. As time passed, Elian's companions went their separate ways, each carrying the light of their journey in their own way. Sir Aldrich, his honour restored, returned to the royal court, where he served as a loyal knight, his name forever bound to the tale of Luminara. Mira, restless as ever, journeyed to distant lands, her sharp wit and skill making her a legend in her own right. And Leora, the healer, returned to her forest, where the spirits whispered to her of the peace that had been restored. But Elian remained in Hearthstone, his legacy not one of power or wealth, but of quiet strength and unwavering light. And though he never sought the glory that others might have craved, his story was passed down through the ages as a reminder to all who heard it, that even the humblest of hearts can carry the greatest light.